Hello and welcome to Kinship Connects, a podcast from SDA Kinship, sharing our stories, our journeys. And my name is Floyd Poenitz, and today it is my privilege to speak with Kendra Arsenault. Thank you so much, Kendra, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you today with us. We have some projects that we're going to talk about a little later on. Some of our audience already know the name and know you, and others don't. So what we're going to do is try to dive in and, find out who Kendra is. So tell us a little bit about where you're at and what you're doing today, these days.
Okay. So right now I am located in Boston, and definitely a change of pace for me. I'm a California girl, so cold weather is not doing many favors. But I currently am working on a podcast called Imago Gay, and I'm doing that in partnership with you as well as Spectrum Magazine. And I'm really excited about it. I think it can be hopefully pushing a conversation forward that's much needed.
Yeah, definitely. And we're going to talk about that in just a little bit more in depth. But let's go back a little bit. And where did you grow up? I think you said you're not used to the cold there. So where is home, and kind of what was your young life like?
Yeah, my young life. Let me take you back. So I grew up in California, particularly the Monterey Bay Area, but I lived in different parts of California. So I went to UCLA and spent 4 years in LA. I lived in like West LA, Long Beach, spent some time in Riverside. And then I moved up kind of Northern California towards like the Santa Cruz area, which is not that far from Monterey, but they consider it like the South Bay area. So pretty much spent most of my life in California. And this is really the longest that I've been an expatriate of my native state.
Wow. Do you hope to go back there sometime, or is East Coast your home for a while now?
You know, I would love to go back to California if I could afford it. California is just so expensive. So right. We'll see. Yeah. You know, well, maybe if they change.
A lot of Californians are coming to Texas now, so you might want to consider, we're a little bit warmer than you are there. So
yeah, or maybe just if I can become like a televangelist and make lots and lots of money.
Exactly. That
my $1 million a year salary. Yep.
Sounds great. So tell me a little bit about your connection to Adventism. When did that come into your life, and how was that for you?
Yeah, it's an interesting experience. I have a biracial experience and very much a bicultural experience. So, and that biculturalism is because like my family is not really religious churchgoers. Hold on, I think this is my dog. Let me getting my attention. He has this steak bone that he likes to squeak, and then he goes off into his singing voice.
They don't want to be ignored, that's for sure. No. So, okay, cool.
So yeah, so my family was not very religious, but when I was about 10 years old, I had a friend in the neighborhood, and she invited me to church, and I ended up going to an Adventist church. I got baptized around 12 and kind of lived in this kind of dual space where I had my church life, I had my other life. So, yeah.
Yeah. So going to Sabbath school kind of hooked you on Adventism. And so, yeah, good. And did that cause any problems at home, or did you keep it fairly separate?
It was interesting. I think, I think both of my parents, my dad came from like a Catholic upbringing, and my mom had like a Catholic, and then her mom turned Protestant. So they were familiar, but they weren't like practicing. So it wasn't too strange for me to go to church. I think my mom had a lot of skepticism about the church. I think she saw a lot of the cracks and fissures of the local community, and probably thought it wasn't the healthiest place in the world for me. But me, on the other hand, I saw like Jesus and faith and a big God. And I think there was a part of me that was just maybe so hungry for connection, that, God was that thing that could really fill that need. And so I think there's a lot of factors playing, but generally they're very supportive in the sense of like, you do you, girl. So
Good.
yeah.
Yeah. And you made a lot of friends in the Adventist church in the meantime, I'm assuming. So yeah. Well, excellent. And so your primary schooling or through high school or whatever was all in public school, correct?
Yes. So grew up public school, went to a public university. Andrews was the first kind of religious institution I've ever been to. And I was already in my 30s when that happened. So
okay. So you had a degree already before you went to Andrews. And what was that in?
I had an international development and African American studies degree from UCLA.
Okay. And so what does that exactly mean or entail?
So it's an interesting story because I originally went to college as an English major. In high school, I was a slam poet. I would go to these slam poet competitions and it was so much fun. But when I got to college, a lot of our curriculum was very like European and it felt very narrow. We were reading Beowulf and like in the original language. And it was very dull. I felt like this was an opportunity for me to have a lot of exposure to culture and to different perspectives. And I wanted to be well informed. And so I changed it to international development. And that's basically looking at how the United States and its economy interacts with other developing nations. And so ways that we sabotage other economies by subsidizing like exported foods into their country and then making their local markets kind of basically go bankrupt because of that. They can't compete with the subsidies coming over. And then just looking at all these little dynamics and African American studies. And that was a part that I felt like was a really relevant part of connecting with some of my cultural history.
Great. Sounds very interesting. Yeah. So you said you went to Andrews in your 30s. Is that correct? Yeah.
That is correct.
So there was a few years in between your studying times. And in that time, did you have any clue that you might be LGBTQIA plus?
I think like it definitely was not a surprise, even to my friends in high school, because we had a lot of we had a lot of gay moments. And I had a friend who recently sent me some photos, and I was like, yeah, this is definitely us not being very truthful to ourselves. But in college, I had more of an experimental phase of like dating women and like, but I never in anything serious in particular. But I think what kind of was alarming for me is I was dating a guy. We were one of the nicest guys I'd ever been with. And we ended up becoming engaged at one point. He was an Adventist. And I remember him telling me one day, like, hey, like, I don't think you've ever really kissed me, like for real. And I was like, oh, and I was thinking about that to myself. And I was like, I wonder why that is, So I remember we're sitting in the car together and like, I'm like, okay, I'm going to really kiss you this time. And I remember closing my eyes and I'm thinking about a time that I felt completely like in my own body, in myself. And it was actually like I started thinking about an earlier relationship that I had with the woman who we had a very close connection. I felt safe. I felt myself. And so I'm picturing her and I'm kissing him and I'm thinking, this is not a permanent solution to this intimacy that he was looking for me that I was not able to show up for. And so anyway, we didn't make it. But I think I never took that very seriously. I knew that was there. And I just thought, I need to grow up. I need to do the things that are expected of me. And shortly after that, I really went into like a really conservative phase in my faith. So college was a time I was really challenging a lot of ideas. I was around a lot of communities that were different religious backgrounds and phenomenal people. So even veganism, that is like an Adventist staple. I never learned that from Adventist. I learned that from some Muslim friends. And so I had all these friends who were doing these humanitarian services, really progressive thinking, really like world changers in that sense. And they were not Christian. And so a part of me really challenged, do we have truth? Is just truth kind of relative? And do we all have pieces of that truth? Or so it set me on this like existential crises, right? Where I think there's a lot of things going on, right? I'm away from home, probably not economically stable, making a lot of risky moves, really trying to explore the edges of, my experience and my youth.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that kind of put me in a place where I wanted to seek stability. And in seeking stability, coming back to a simpler time when, all I knew was Jesus and that relationship. And so I went back, but I also went back to much more conservative version of Christianity. And a part of that was like, I think I fell into a space where I began to distrust myself, and I was not happy with all the choices that I had made and wasn't sure who I was. And I think in that vacuum, some very strong personalities stepped in, and these strong personalities were very conservative in their viewpoints and also affirmed that I could not trust myself. And so I ended up kind of being taken down this really long journey that I'm still recovering from, which was a very ultra conservative space, and really learning to integrate my faith with who I am in a holistic way.
You think that's sort of typical, because so often we're told, don't trust your own feelings and your own gut, because the devil is there trying to get you. Just stand fast on the word of God and what the church tells you, kind of thing. Do you think that's kind of the space you were in or exploring at that point, maybe?
Oh, absolutely. I think, it's a rhetoric that we often hear in churches that's just like, you don't know what love is. And so God might be doing something that's loving that seems evil to you. So, but it is love. And people often also show up in that way. Like, you might think I'm being cruel to you right now, but I'm doing the most loving thing I could possibly do.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's a narrative they even tell themselves, because they recognize that something about the way that they're responding is cruel. Right. And it's just kind of justifying it in some way. But I think in Adventism, especially, we have this history of like Ezekiel and this, what is it, the watchman, right? Like blood will be on your hands. I remember being told this, like, as soon as I came back into the church, I remember being at a Bible study, and it was about Ezekiel and the watchman, and God telling him, like, blood will be on your hands if you don't tell them the actual truth. And I think that there are a lot of people who feel like, if I don't, for example, when it comes to LGBTQ community, if I don't quote Leviticus and Romans 1 to them, like, I'm going to be responsible for allowing them to like fall away in their own sin. Right.
Right.
And so you get a lot of that. And it was just a perfect storm of things that really kind of indoctrinated me in a way that I just kind of shrank as a person. And it took me a long time to kind of crawl out of that hole.
Yeah. I think a lot of people are in that space, and we think that's the healthy space, but it turns out to not be good for us spiritually or psychologically or anything. So yeah. So during the time between UCLA and Andrews, were you actively trying to put together sexuality and spirituality, or did you just kind of keep those separate and focus on spirituality only?
I think I was really trying to focus on spirituality. And I think I had moments where I had this roommate. We were working for developmentally disabled adults. And it's a really cool program where they created like independent living situations, and you had 2 roommates, and we would help with like the daily tasks and like all that kind of stuff. So I had a roommate, and I remember just feeling attractions towards her, but I also remember thinking like, this is something that I would never cross that line. And I knew myself, like I have a really strong will. And so I knew that that was something I would never embark on, but I didn't know what to make of those feelings other than this is temptation that I must flee from. And so, but yeah, there were other moments during that journey, during that wilderness period, that I was still trying to like not wrestle with those questions because I didn't have really the theological tools. I mean, I was in a space where like I drink coffee on occasion now. That was not a part of my world at one point, right? Like I was very strict, even contemplating giving up chocolate.
Wow. Okay.
You know, like very conservative in how I dressed, and very, like I would say, underdeveloped. Like I never played with makeup because I thought I can't be ostentatious, right? I never did these things that were a part of my own development as a woman. And if I had developed, I regressed myself back to a place where I did not no longer participate in these things. And so in that sense, yeah, that there were a lot of things that I wasn't engaging with during that time, my sexuality being one of them, right?
Yeah. Sounds like it wasn't quite fulfilling in the end, at least not what you were hoping it would be. Yeah, something was still missing.
Yeah, it actually took me, we could be here for a long time, Floyd.
Hey, that's okay.
It took me to being in an abusive relationship with somebody who had this male headship theology for me to finally fully understand the fruits of this conservative niche, right? So like there was something in me that, you know, and I had the most simplistic interpretation of scripture. So, you know, turn the other cheek. Literally, you know, if this person spit on me or hit me, I literally would do those things, right? And it was something that I obviously did not have a full interpretation of how to handle these situations, but I was very literal in how I went about it. And when I realized that this is not working, right? Like my interpretation, there's no amount, because even the submission part, like, you know, to be docile, to be acquiescent, there was something that felt damaging to my own self, right? Like I felt I was diminishing my own value every time I complied or silenced my own voice, and it took a while. It took a while for me being in that, where I realized, you know, I can't, it's not working. It's not changing this person. They're not becoming a humbler, nicer. I'm not winning this person over through the gospel, through my actions. I am just continuing to diminish and abuse myself, or allow abuse to happen to me.
But you were doing it for Jesus.
Doing it for Jesus. And I actually wrote a little tiny book during this period called Into the Darkness Where God Is. And it was this, and I look back on it now and I'm like, man, I could see somebody who was trying to make meaning out of a really dark, abusive situation. And you can find it if you're looking for it. Like you can find meaning in suffering. You can find meaning in taking on the kind of sacrificial role that you want to play, right? But is that God's will for you? And at some point, it just got to be too much. And I was like, I can't, it is going to destroy my mental health. It's going to destroy an image that I have of myself. And that's when I realized, like, the fruit of this is not, I'm doing something wrong. And I would rather go get theological training if I really want to know the answers, be in a body of people who are not going to hurt me in this way, and figure out truth from there. So.
Great. So that's what kind of led you then to Andrews and a new degree.
Yeah. I went there because, God has always been, after college, it's been like such a pivotal part of my identity that I literally did not really know who I was outside of this. And I was definitely operating in a space where I didn't even know who I should be, right? Like what career I should take, what path I should be on. Like everything was so deferential, like deferring to like, okay, God, are you going to come into my life and write down on a piece of paper what I need to be? You know me better than I know myself. So, and that piece of paper never came, right? And so I think a part of me was like, I have no answers for my life at this point. And if I think that all of my answers are going to be found in God, then I need to actually go to seminary and maybe I'm going to find more answers about my life and what I should be doing and putting the pieces that somewhere along the way got lost and misplaced.
Yeah. And in that journey, I bet more questions also appeared.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you went to Andrews, and what degree were you looking for there, or what degree did you get there?
So I just finished with my Master's of Divinity.
Congratulations.
And thank you very much.
Yeah.
Long journey.
Yeah. So was the Andrews experience something that helped you transition from the previous, what you were searching and wasn't working for you, to where you are today?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. And I definitely believe, God is a liberator, and sometimes the way that we interpret him is not always so. But I think he was trying to set me free in a lot of ways. And the first semester, like I was there the summer of 2018. And the first semester, one of the classes that I took had to deal with contemporary issues in Adventism. And it was talking about things like women's ordination, et cetera, et cetera. And at the time, I was entering into a program that I was like, being like a pastor was not even in question. I just wanted to be there for my own personal benefit. But as I was taking this class, I was introduced to all of this study that was very affirming of women in ministry and affirming of equality, and kind of really broke down how is it that we are interpreting scripture. For example, when it comes to slavery, the Bible talks about slavery. Paul speaks affirmatively of slavery. Slaves, obey your masters, right? It's in the fourth commandment, right? So how have we arrived at a place where we realize that slavery is an abomination? But here it is present in the Bible. And why are we not willing to use those same hermeneutics when it comes to women? And just to find like, wow, that was like such a breakthrough moment for me. Like really, context and time and a progression in moral ethics really does help you become a better exegeter of scripture. So yeah, that was like my first introduction to seminary. And I feel like that was the beginning of some of the shackles coming off.
Cool. That's good to hear. Would you consider Andrews theologically conservative, liberal, or middle of the road?
It's so funny because before I went there, everyone, there's all these scary things about Jesuits teaching at the seminary.
Yeah.
But I'd say most of the professors are very conservative. The most liberal thing that they have about them is their progressive ethics when it comes to women in ministry. Everything else, is pretty much conservative or middle of the road, right? Very like trying to put in the balances, but very Adventist, absolutely 100%. Scripture is very literal. There is no, definitely a 6-day creation, like very, very conservative in that sense. And, for Adventism, people would say, well, I'm glad to hear that. So,
yeah, sure. It follows the church's official teachings and things. Yeah. So you weren't the only MDiv female student there.
No, thank goodness.
No. Okay, good to hear. Yeah. So during your time at Andrews, you got involved with podcasting. Is that something you had been interested in for a while, or is that just something you learned there?
So I'd done some like radio programs in the past, and I'd been doing like communications and uh, all that type of stuff for like 10 years prior, or maybe 8 at the time. So when I came to campus, I wanted to do more video editing. I was making pretty good money doing that as an independent contractor, but in Berrien Springs, there was no work for me really. And so I ended up becoming a video editor, and the company that I was working for was looking for new projects, and I put a proposal to have like an Adventist TED Talk. I myself was being so liberated by what I was hearing inside the walls of the seminary that was much more balanced and sound reasoning than this place that I'd come from. And I thought, man, I'm sure there's a lot of people who might benefit from this. So we started on that project, and it lasted for about 3 years.
Great. And what was that called?
It's called Advent Next.
Advent Next. I know some of our listeners were probably subscribers to that podcast and enjoyed it because you did cover quite a variety of topics. Do you know how many subscribers or listeners you had just on the average with Advent Next?
So I had about 5,000 to 6,000 listeners a month on the podcast side.
Wow.
And then I had, for the YouTube, we had like about 45 to 5,000 subscribers for the YouTube channel. And so we had a good amount of listenership.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. I know people want to hear these things, and whether they agree with everything they hear, but just to be able to discuss it, I think is very important. And that's one of the challenges for Kinship, for SDA Kinship, to just open the topic and be able to talk about things like that. So what happened with Advent Next? Why are you still not why are you not still podcasting for them?
Yeah. So I think over time, as I was doing Advent Next, even though like I came out the gate, the first episode was on women's ordination, and it was very controversial.
Yeah.
There was a lot of bandwidth that I was given to do theology and talk kind of challenging topics. We talked about Black theology. We talked about like women's theology. We really had, I wanted to kind of bring topics that people were interested in and asking questions about the Trinity, ecumenism, etc. And I had been learning so many tools that I thought were important for life and for wholeness and for integration. And about 2 years into it, I did a podcast with Paul Anthony Turner on looking at side B theology.
And what does side B? What does side B mean?
So side B is meaning that you can identify as gay, but you have to remain celibate. And at that time, that was the most progressive that had been exposed to as far as in the theological circles. And it had to do with like this affirmation of identity. And Paul did such a wonderful job talking about the brokenness of heterosexuality, the uniqueness that, the reason why we have shows like Queer Eye, right? Like there is a perspective that is brought from this lens that is unique to this person and doesn't just have to do with sex. And at the time I thought, wow, this is really progressive. And I think it began to turn the wheels of me looking more progressively at this theology in particular, especially because I was so, I was always so hurt by this particular aspect of what we do, right? Like, I think there are a lot of things that we might be embarrassed about from our church. Like, I'm like embarrassed by, when I say embarrassed, I mean, if I were to take somebody that I met off the street and bring them into this church, what are the things that they would be encountering that I would have to shield them from or warn them about, right? So if it's a woman, I might have to tell them about how they're dressed or their jewelry, or they might hear some things about ordination, or like things that I feel we should be progressing past, because the kinds of ethics that we are demonstrating in our local churches is not I would say it's not appealing. It's not charming. Yeah. It's not winsome. It's not the gospel, right?
Right.
So I've always had kind of a problem with this theology, the way that the church has approached it, but I didn't have a better one. And I didn't agree, but I didn't, I think I was complicit, right? But this wasn't actually where I stood in this. And it was a very underdeveloped part of my theological training, something we did not talk about other than just no, right?
There were no classes on the pros and cons and anything.
No,
Okay.
there were no classes other than like, there was already statements made about this is wrong and this is why, and this is why we're not flexible about this. But it wasn't anything that, there were so many holes in the argument that I didn't feel were being looked at. And
Right.
so when I brought Paul on the first time, I wanted to bring somebody who had the experience of identifying as queer and then who's also working through that and doing theology, because I didn't want another straight white male to talk about something in a condescending way about a people group that they didn't identify with.
Sure.
And I was very conscientious of like my listenership. And also, I don't want to be that person, right? Like if I'm finding an expert, I don't think the expert is the one with the PhD who thinks that they've closed all the loops in logic. I want the person who is wrestling with this and has a stake in this to talk about it. So after that, I began to think a little bit more and really ask myself and do some studies in this direction, because like I said, it was a very underdeveloped part of my theology. And so the next year around, I again brought on Paul and Alicia Johnston, and I wanted to hear these views because Paul had since moved to a more progressive theology, and Alicia Johnston was coming out as like an affirming view of queer identity.
And Paul was also a student there, right?
Yeah, he was.
He was a student at Andrews. Okay.
He was, but he graduated, and so
right. Okay.
And so she came out with a book, and I wanted to give space for the affirmatives. Like, let's actually have this conversation. And I guess I didn't really know that that was crossing the line, apparently. At the time, I was trying to be very neutral in my position as a host, but there were like a lot of comments that I just felt were very just not considerate and small-minded. And I thought that I would do a follow-up episode with Paul to kind of look at, like, is there room to agree to disagree, right? This is a very incendiary topic that probably will not come to a consensus on. We can't even come to a consensus on women's ordination. So this one definitely probably not going to come to a consensus on, but is there a way that we can stop hurling stones and begin to cohabitate in these spaces and to stop the condescension and to really understand how our theology impacts lives? And at the end of that episode, I disclosed that I was also bisexual. And this is why this study is very important to me. And also to kind of like show solidarity with my guests, because, you know, I didn't want them to be taking the brunt of the fire of the things that people were saying. And so after I did that episode, 2 days later, I was called in and I was let go of my position. So, yeah.
Wow. So you had crossed the line of their comfort zone.
Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Were you told that you had been let go because of what you said, or, I mean, what was the reason given?
I think they understood the legal implications. And so they're like, we're not letting you go because you're bisexual, just to be clear. But you have, there's been a breach of trust. And that breach of trust is so irreparable that you can never host the show again. And the seminary and the professors don't want anything to do with you. And of course, that was probably a little exaggerated. Like every professor, they all came together and unanimously. But I think just all of that, just the idea that my professors, who in some ways would become colleagues, right, in ministry, that people that I had, I would say, like, you know, good professional relationships with, to think that they would say that was just so heartbreaking, and also to lose something that I spent so much time trying to build up and putting myself and my heart and my soul into really trying to create a quality product. So that was that.
Yeah, yeah. Now Andrews has a gay straight alliance called
Mhm.
Haven, I believe. Um, did anyone from Haven come to your side or pat your back at least, or say, "Hey, sorry this happened"? I'm not going to name faculty names or student names there, but I mean, did you find any support from Andrews in that aspect?
I think I found. I think people didn't know what to do. I think there were some people some people wrote one line and said, "I'm so sorry, what happened?"
Hmm.
And some other person had wrote like, "This is really unfortunate." Like, and there were some people who like wrote to me, but it wasn't like, you know, my door is open. Let's talk about this. I know you're probably going through a hard time. I ended up reaching out to a couple professors because I was getting kind of these nasty emails from a professor, and I wanted to know what to do with about it because I had one semester left, and I didn't want to. I didn't want to be harassed. I was going through a grief process, and just felt like this person was very inconsiderate to the fact that I'm a human being. This is not time to talk your theological viewpoints or to chide me about all the things that you think I did wrong. Um, and so I wanted to see like what I should do. And I think there are a few that were supportive and helped me to know next steps. And there were others that were very much like, as long as you're side B, you're cool. Don't worry about it. Right. Like, but in my mind, I'm like, I didn't really profess a theological viewpoint on the podcast. I
Right.
did identify as bi, but I didn't say, "Hey, and I'm an affirming theologian now." I kind of let it just be hazy because I understood the implications of that in some sense. And I think just to know that it was like, "Hey, as long as you're side B, we got you, or you're safe." Um, but it was more like if you were to publicly be anything other than this, even my schooling would be in jeopardy. And I saw the retreat, right? And so I don't know. I think they rubbed me the wrong way for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Because immediately there are a lot of assumptions that happen, and on their part of, just by saying I'm bisexual. So yeah, sad, sad. But you've graduated now. You have your MDiv. You're
Yeah.
on your own. That's a chapter that hopefully has been closed and or dealt with.
I that chapter has been dealt with, but dealing with these people have not, right? Like I think
Uh,
that Adventism has a really interesting history with who they consider heretics, right? Like we have this ML Andreessen, we have, these different people of I don't know, pioneer history that are often touted as, see, look at how they have fallen off the wagon, EJ Wagner, um, and I think that when somebody begins to question mainline theology on a particular doctrine, um, that becomes very like uh, you automatically kind of come a pariah, right? And so I find it interesting, if anything, other than why are we not like, why have we distilled people down to this particular point to say people are their theological beliefs rather than people are the flesh and breath and heartbeat,
yeah,
and that they are made in the image of God? Why are we not treating even so called heretics with that same dignity rather than this condescension?
yeah, exactly. I've become a podcast junkie the last several months, and I really enjoy listening to a podcast about the history of the church. And it's gone through from 1844 onward, and that word heretic comes up a lot. And so I've decided that I wear that title as a badge of honor. I like being a heretic. I like questioning. And, if you can't give me a good answer, then maybe there's a reason why I'm questioning certain things that the church teaches or says or whatever. That doesn't mean that I've, given up hope for the Adventist church. I love my church, but I think Jesus wants us to question things and to fully understand and not just go along with the flow. So if you want to be a heretic with me, welcome.
All right. It's a club.
Great. So that moves us on to this new project. Now you're doing your own podcast still under Kendras, under your name, right?
Yeah,
that's still going on. But tell us about this new venture that's coming up in February now.
So the new podcast is called Imago Gay, and
now that's Latin or Greek to me or something. What does that mean?
So Imago Gay is a term you often hear, like in I don't know, theological Christian circles, but it's a play off of Imago Dei, and it just means in the image of God. Imago, image, Dei, God, and it's kind of this affirmation of like, every person is made in the image of God. And it's this baseline of like, let's not forget that when we do ministry, that we are all made in the image of God. The person on the street, the CEO, the whomever, we are all on equal footing ground. And as a statement of that affirmation, to include queer members is the term that we've coined as Imago Gay. And still the same spelling, but just a G in front. So GEI.
Okay. Great. Now, is this podcast going to focus mainly on queer issues with the church and that kind of thing, or will it branch out to other things as well? What can we look forward to?
So I think there's so much to unpack when it comes to queer theology. So we're probably going to be a little top heavy in the beginning to really like bring the members or listeners up to speed and really opening, hopefully, a door of questioning or a door of like possibility. Is there room for a relationship for LGBTQ lives in the church? And so opening that door, but then also looking at other minority perspectives, right? Black theology, Latina theology, a womanist theology, right? Like these are all perspectives that, because of the way that seminary is often structured, which is a very white male perspective, hetero perspective, you don't get to hear these other approaches to faith. I mean, the history of Christianity, we think it comes down through, it's like Catholicism, and then there's Martin Luther and Calvin, and it's very anglicized. And so how do we incorporate other perspectives that really represent the growing demographic of the church and the growing demographic of the United States in general?
Right. I think queer theology, LGBTQ issues permeates every topic within the church because we're a part of every topic. We're everywhere. So to be able to understand that, I think is a very important step. So I'm going to throw you off with a off the wall question. What if someone says, being LGBT is a choice and you could choose not to be?
I hope that if they listen to the podcast and they listen to the experiences of the people that we are going to bring on, that they'll see that it's not really a choice, right? And that a lot of people, the choice that they were brought down to is a choice between, I'm either going to live in agreement with my true self or I'm going to kill myself, right? And a lot of times that's what it comes down to. Either I'm going to live in my authenticity or I can't be here anymore. And that's not really a choice, right? That's something that you have to choose if you want to live. And so I think hopefully through education, whoever says that will be, and I think people say that honestly, because they want to give the person they're telling that to room to come in agreement with their understanding of scripture, right? If being queer is a choice, just like drinking alcohol is a choice, or like if it's equated to such, then there's a cure for it. There's hope that you can change. There's hope that you can make another choice. And I think the root of that question comes down to, how do I get you to fit in the box that I need you to get into for me to feel safe that you're saved? And I think hopefully we can open up that box a little bit and see if God can't save us without having to fit into that.
Wow, That's great. Yeah. I'm keeping you longer than my normal video podcast, but you're just so fascinating to talk to. I do have a couple more questions, but one more question that I'm going to throw at you that I didn't prepare you for. What would you say to people, and I think this is going to come up in your podcasts maybe, but people that say, okay, you're gay, you need to find a happy place, just leave the church and go find your own church or be a part of another church. The Adventist church obviously doesn't want you. So why do you want to stay?
I think that's such a it's such a privileged perspective. And it's kind of how do we get this out of our sight? How do we stop having to deal with this? How do we just go somewhere? Please leave. And I would say, how unchristian of you, right? To make that request that I would leave the church. And for somebody, I think, who does have the heart of Christ, who's like, I want you to have salvation, and I want you to know Jesus, and I want you to have all those things that are given to you by a birthright because you are Imago Dei, you are made in the image of God. If I were to really believe that, then I would be looking to find ways to keep this person in community. And so for a lot of people who have been told to get out of the church and are looking for a new community, it's a really hard thing to find a new community, because it's not like you stop believing in the Sabbath or you stop believing in any other tenet of Adventism. It's just a disagreement on this particular issue that has to do with actual love. Well, we agree about who people can love. And it's not about child sacrifice. It's not about anything other than a disagreement on, do I believe that you can love this other person? I would never be an advocate for same gender abuse, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, can these people live in a respectful union where they honor one another? Is that permissible? Can we live in a church that says that's okay, that we're talking about love? So anyway, anybody who says that, I think they're looking for a cheap escape from having to actually deal with the issue. They want it gone, but it's not going away.
Wow. Thank you so much. That's great. I totally look forward to this new podcast, and hopefully we can get you back on here and a little later on, a few months down the road, and see how things are going and just check in with you. So starting February 4th, I think is the premiere date.
That's the tentative date, yes.
Yeah. As long as COVID and everything else behaves, that's the date. So where can we find you, and where can we find this podcast?
So the podcast will be available on Spotify, Apple Podcast at Imago Gay. You can also, if you follow me on Twitter or on Instagram at Kendra Arsenault with an X, I'll have updates about the weekly podcast, as well as you can follow whatever journey I'm on. Great.
And this is in collaboration with Spectrum Magazine, and SDA Kinship. So both of those websites will be able to also give you some updates and things like that. And if anyone really is blessed by it and wants to show a little bit of appreciation, how can they either donate to the cause? Because I know you're
I'm a cause
fresh out of college. Yeah. So how can they donate to you?
So I have a Patreon page. So patreon.com at Kendra Arsenault with an X. And I think it's a link into my Instagram description. So anybody who's listening in appreciates the work, you can buy me a cup of coffee that I now happily drink.
Yeah, wonderful, awesome. Any final parting words?
I just, I am so impressed with what you are doing with SDA Kinship and your listenership, because you've been doing this before it was popular, right? You were doing this before there was even the term for homosexuality, and real pioneers in that work for a very long time. And I hope that people really understand, and that you also get the credit for the work that you've been putting in for so long, in which nobody has taken notice. And there's many listeners out there like that who've been on this journey for a much longer journey than I have, and it's been a painful one. And so I just applaud everyone's resilience and faith and hope as they continue on that journey.
Great. Yeah, it's definitely been a team effort. We've all we're all standing on the shoulders of those who came before us. And so hopefully we can continue that work. So great. So Kendra, thanks for sharing with us today. And thanks to the audience. We hope that today's podcast was interesting and has given our listeners something to think about. SDA Kinship, Seventh-day Adventist Kinship, is the only LGBTQIA+ affirming community for current and former Adventists. We welcome not only our Rainbow Alphabet members, but also their parents and families who want to learn more about us and how to support their loved ones. And we appreciate our supportive allies who stand up with us to make a difference in our church and our world. You can check us out on the web at sdakinship.org or follow us on social media at SDA Kinship. If you have any questions or comments, you can always email me at info@sdakinship.org. And we look forward to having you with us on the next podcast release. Take care until then.